Hello, I'm Llewellyn King, the host of White House Chronicle. Welcome to our broadcast today. Thank you for coming along. I am very excited because we have an extraordinary guest, a friend of mine, but a man of great talent and tremendous vision. He is Hedrick Smith, a name you may know from his many years at the New York Times when he was in the Washington Bureau, but also overseas a great deal. A name to conjure with in journalistic terms. Hedrick, welcome to the broadcast.
Llewellyn, thank you, sir.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's just a joy to have you at the table. Tell me, you are no longer at the New York Times. You've retired, as they say, but we never retire, do we?
Yeah, no, write a bunch of books, make a bunch of documentaries, work on a website, follow the news. I've got a new documentary I'm working on right now.
What is that documentary about?
It's going to be the people versus the politicians. Are there citizen reformers out there that are making a difference? And indeed there are in Connecticut, California, South Dakota, Missouri, Michigan, Ohio, Florida, you name it, Arizona, all over the place.
There's a lot of pessimism.
There's an enormous amount of
pessimism. There's a lot of sense that democracy is in trouble. Democracy is not what it was. Representative government isn't working. It's representing moneyed interests or other constituencies, not the people. But you see something different.
No. You just articulated what probably 70–80% of Americans say to pollsters all the time. Nobody in Washington's listening to me. Moneyed interests have too much power. Lobbyists have too much power. Wealth is too concentrated in this country. That is certainly the attitude. What's interesting and what's not told in most of the media is that, in fact, there are people in various states that are doing something about it. In Connecticut, they have a very effective system for public funding of campaigns. In California, they've exposed the Koch money network, the dark money network that's doing all the things you're talking about. In Florida, they've passed an unbelievable gerrymander reform system that is really changing the politics in Florida. In Washington State and 17 other states, they've passed referendum and resolutions in the legislature to roll back Citizens United. So there's been a backlash against what you're talking about.
You have an organization and a website, and you write about this as well as...
I try to keep up with it.
What is that website? Where can people find it?
You can find that at reclaimtheamericandream.org. And what I'm trying to do is I'm just trying to keep track of what's going on in one state after another, whether you're talking about voting rights or you're talking about gerrymander reform, you're talking about dark money, you're talking about rolling back Citizens United, various things to level the playing field across the country.
You wrote a book about the American dream.
Yeah, but that was the other side.
How it was stolen.
Who stole the American dream was the start. And what happened was when
did you write that book?
I wrote that book, came out 5 years ago in 2012. And what I did is I went around the country making a bunch of speeches. And
so it's important to understand that this has nothing to do with Trump. It was pre-Trump.
We're talking well before Trump. The troubles with the American dream really start in the late 70s, the early 80s. And what you see is just a huge wedge, what I call wedge economics, between the growth of the country and the leveling off of the middle class incomes and earnings and standard of living. The money starts hyper-concentrating at the very top of the American economy, top 1%. From 1979 to 2012, listen to this number, 84% of the added income for the entire nation went to the top 1%. When I first saw that slogan, the 99% and the 1%, I thought, a very clever bumper sticker slogan, but it's not accurate. I mean, that's overdoing it. Maybe the 90% and the 10% or the 80%. No. If you look at the numbers, and we're talking about really good economists doing these studies, 84% went to the top 1% over 33, 34 years. That means the rest of us got 16%, which means the top 1% got 5 times as much growth as the entire rest of the economy. Unbelievable. This is well before Trump. This is before anybody even thinks of Trump running for president, even Trump.
How did this happen? One of the things that made America America was that everybody shared in the prosperity. I remember that when anybody who did a mechanical job, say worked in an automobile body, was middle class, well-to-do, maybe took a vacation to Europe or Canada, had some of the benefits and a pleasant automobile and a pleasant home. That's not true anymore.
Two things mattered in terms of what you just said. The first thing is that the leaders of American business, if you go back and look at Charlie Wilson at General Motors or Reg Jones at General Electric, or Frank Abrams at Standard Oil of New Jersey, now ExxonMobil, if you look at what they said back in the 50s and 60s, they said it was the job of the CEO to balance the economic interests of the various parties that had a stake in the corporation. Well, of course that meant the owners, of course that meant the managers, but it also meant the workers, the suppliers, the communities where they had their factories or where they had their offices. They meant sharing the wealth, paying the middle class well, was the engine that drove growth. Henry Ford said, if I don't pay my workers well, they can't afford to buy Model T cars. Henry Ford introduced the $5 day, which at that point was doubling the pay of the average worker on an assembly line a century ago. Because he said, if I pay them well, they can buy the Model T cars that we're making. So that's the first thing. We had leaders who believed that sharing the wealth was the engine of growth and profits. And the second thing is we had citizen power. If you go back in the 60s and 70s, you have the civil rights movement, you have the women's movement, you have the consumer movement, you have the anti-war movement, you have a whole bunch of movements that are pushing for... And the environmental movement, absolutely. And all these are pushing for the interests of the middle class, of the average voter, and they're having a direct impact on Washington. The environmental movement, you just mentioned that. Earth Day, 1970, 20 million people go into the streets and demonstrate. What happens? Within the next year, Congress passes 6 or 7 major laws: the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Anti-Toxic Substances Act. The middle class was politically active, and it was affecting policy in Washington, which was affecting the taxes. It was affecting minimum wage. The minimum wage was going up with a bipartisan vote all through the 60s and 70s up until you get to about the 1980s. The taxes on the people at the top, under Eisenhower, Republican president, 92% tax rate, gets cut by Kennedy in the 1960s to 77%. So what's going on is that people at the top are seeing the top of the mountain brought down, and people at the bottom are seeing the floor brought up. And so you have a much stronger middle-class economy back in the 60s and 70s than you do today. What happened was power shifted. Instead of having active civic movements that I was just talking about, those grassroots movements, you suddenly have the power of corporate lobbies. You begin to see that with the Lewis Powell memo, a guy named Lewis Powell, a famous attorney.
With a famous law firm who wrote, I actually met him, but he wrote a memo, you tell the story, but which changed everything.
Yeah, he said he wrote a memo for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which they circulated secretly to the CEOs of major American companies.
Who took it to heart.
Who took it to heart. It was amazing. What he said was, you are getting killed in the political arena. The trade union movement, the women's movement, the environmental movement, all these movements I just mentioned are taking you to the cleaners. You need to come to Washington, get organized, come here, spend money, get together, and that's exactly what they did.
Did you see this impact on the bureau of the New York Times in Washington?
I got to tell you, I have to confess, Llewellyn, how I messed it up. I was running the Washington bureau of the New York Times in the late 70s. And I had people working for me who were reporting bits and pieces of this story, but none of us put it together. None of us understood that there was a political sea change that was taking place in the late 70s and the early 80s. But this is before Reagan. Everybody associated with Reagan, and the Republicans get elected in 1980. The real change actually started, believe it or not, under the Democrats with Jimmy Carter in the White House, and the Democrats controlling both houses of Congress. That's when you start to see the capital gains tax come down, you start to see the corporate income tax come down, you start to see all kinds of deregulation of industry, you start to see things that begin to foster the economy that we see today with its huge economic inequalities and its power inequalities in the political system as well. It's amazing. What's happening now is a little bit of what we saw maybe back in the progressive era in the early 20th century.
There was another dynamic, though, and that is that manufacturing went overseas. It followed cheap labor, and that undermined the unions. The unions were very powerful supporters of the middle class. They guaranteed those wages, whether you like unions or not. The only mechanism we seem to have had to keep wages up and keeping pace. They lost their power because they lost their workers. They couldn't organize a union in China or Bangladesh or anywhere else.
They couldn't even organize a union in South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. We had a lot of right-to-work states. You started to see the shoe industry and the textile industry in the Northeast start to move to the Southeast, cheaper labor in the Southeast. It then moved to Mexico, and it then moved to China. You're right. I mean, getting to China, getting to Asia, but there were intermediary steps where this
So there
happened.
was no real powerful, effective, indisputable voice for the middle class.
You're right.
It was a scattered voice. It was a cry in the wilderness. As a journalist in Washington, I knew what was happening, but I didn't understand it any better than the New York Times bureau, which was a great disappointment to me.
Well,
but
we
when
understood it,
people
but we didn't understand it until 20 years
stopped
later.
Cultivating us. They stopped needing to get the press on board when they wanted to do something. It was done directly with the Congress. Suddenly the pressure groups didn't try to create coalitions. The world had changed, and it was a slow change, but it was a definite change. And journalism became an outsider rather than being an insider in a sense. The news was there, the news, but the role of journalism in decision-making had changed. It wasn't important. The front page of the New York Times, the front page of the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, those front pages had been the agenda for America. They had been the day's work on Capitol Hill. They ceased to be. The memo from this person or that person became the agenda for the day. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that. The decline in the power, political and economic power of unions is enormously important for the fate of the American middle class, and the influence of the mainstream media is important. But there are two other things that happened, Llewellyn. One is the rise of political money. Political action committees, PACs, that we all talk about today. In the early 1970s, there was not much going on. There were labor unions that had PACs. There were a few businesses that had PACs. Not much happened. Then there was a court decision and a ruling by the Federal Election Commission that allowed corporate PACs, and they suddenly took off. So we had a situation where you had lobbyists. In 1971 or 2, when Lewis Powell wrote his memo, maybe only 175 businesses even had offices in Washington. By the time Reagan is elected, 2,200. It mushrooms. So these people all starting to swarm on Capitol.
The trade associations
and the trade associations
to Washington.
And they all moved to Washington. So in response to this Powell memo, and it isn't just Powell's influence, it is the influence of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and it's the fact that CEOs resonated to what Powell said. Oh my God, he said, you're right. We're not effective politically. We need to organize. So you suddenly see these political action committees, money being spent on political campaigns starts to skyrocket at that time. Now it's going through the roof, but it changes.
Hedrick Smith, hold the thought while we tell our radio listeners who you are. Primarily, for the benefit of our listeners on Sirius XM radio and those listeners who are getting this program on the audio services of the Voice of America, you are listening to White House Chronicle, which is coming to you from Washington, D.C. today. This program can be seen on 200 American television stations, also around the globe on the aforementioned Voice of America. And a little slip there. Our guest today, my guest today, is Hedrick Smith, for many years, a major figure in the New York Times, and I am your host, Llewellyn King. Hedrick Smith, how do we fix it if it is broken in the way that you have laid out?
Well, I've got to tell you, we don't fix it the way the Republican Congress has just passed a tax bill. I mean, they haven't finished it yet. It's going to have to be negotiated between the House and the Senate version. But this is a real disaster in terms of inequality in the American economy that we've just been talking about. There was a French economist named Thomas Piketty, and about 3 or 4 years ago, he came out with a book called Capital in the 21st Century. And he said in very simple terms what's wrong. What he said was, if the return to Wall Street, the money people make by investing money, if the return to them is higher than the rate of growth of the whole economy and of wages, inequality is going to keep exploding. So if people on Wall Street are making 7, 8, 10, 12, 15% more each year, and people at their jobs are getting wage increases of 1 or 2%, and the economy is growing at 2 or 3%, we're looking at exploding inequality. And this tax bill, with its huge cut in corporate tax rates from 35% to 20% means that corporations are going to have much more profits. And what corporations are doing with profits, according to a very interesting study by a University of Massachusetts economist, is they're returning 91% of their earnings, their profits, to their shareholders. 91%. They're only investing 9% in growth. If you go back to the 50s and 60s, they split roughly 50-50. They gave about half to their shareholders, and they spent about half on retraining workers, giving workers more pay, R&D.
And of course, the lower the tax rate, the less the incentive to invest, because you can deduct the investment.
Well, they're going to get an immediate write-off. But the point is, if we're concerned about the inequality in the American economy, and we should be, then what the Republicans have just done, or in their process of doing, and I presume they're going to complete the job in one form or another, it's really the wrong way to go. I mean, the way to go is to do the opposite. It is to cut the tax. If you want to cut the tax rate for corporations, then close the loopholes. Close the loopholes for the oil industry, for the pharmaceutical industry, for the financial industry, for the defense industry, and make it even so there's no deficit. Then corporations will wind up by paying net the same amount of taxes. They just will have a much lower tax rate to work from, which is a reasonable thing. American companies that operate in this country ought not to be penalized. The ones that can move overseas, they pay a much lower rate overseas.
Your website, let's give that to people again.
Well, we can talk about doing political or economic reform. I've got a section on the website called Inclusive Capitalism.
Just tell people how to find it.
ReclaimTheAmericanDream.org. ReclaimTheAmericanDream.org.
And this grew out of a book you wrote.
This grew out of Who Stole the American Dream, which is still in paperback.
And a fairly seminal book.
I think it is, but I'm prejudiced, Llewellyn. It was one of the first books that tried to examine for ordinary readers, not academic readers, but ordinary readers, why we have a dysfunctional political system and how we got such grievous inequality in our economy today. Yeah.
I live in a fairly poor area. I'm not poor, but I'm not crying poverty. But I live in a poor area of Rhode Island with wonderful, hard-working, working, middle-class people. They voted for Trump. They still think Trump is being misused by the media. They believe deeply in fake news. How are we going to change things when you have that kind of dynamic, when that kind of intellectual corruption has taken place and become established?
It's going to be difficult, but one of the problems is the Democratic Party, which could be making the argument to the people you're talking about in a fairly effective way and say, look, we get it. You were left out over the last 20 or 30 years of America's growth. America's great corporations moved overseas. They moved the jobs overseas. They moved the factories overseas. They're now in the process of moving banking and research and development overseas. So you got left out. We need to form a new strategy that takes care of you, that includes you, that retrains you. We need to provide incentives to businesses to invest here at home. Lowering the tax rate is all right if you shut those loopholes, including the loophole that gets corporations away from paying taxes when they move their jobs and get their profits overseas. But I think the Democratic Party and other people need to address this. Notice what happened when Bernie Sanders started talking about this. Bernie Sanders was talking to some of the people you're talking about in Rhode Island, where you live. But when you saw Bernie Sanders go across the Middle West, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and then out west, he picked up an awful lot of people who were economically unhappy. His message was very different from Trump's message. They both were reaching out to the same sets of people who were economically left out in the last 20 or 30 years of American growth. And Trump's answer was basically, trust me, I can take care of it. I'm a businessman and I know how to run it. We're going to have people see what the result is from Trump. And Bernie Sanders says, no. The thing to do is we got to curb Wall Street. We got to curb the corporations. We got to go back and give you free education. We got to, for your kids. We got to, so we can train them for the next generation. We got to give you free health care so you can take care of your family, so you can climb up out of the trench. So there are two answers here. And the way it went in the Democratic Party was Hillary Clinton got the nomination and Bernie Sanders didn't, but it was extraordinarily close. And what that tells you was that the 2016 election was not a traditional right-left election. between liberals and conservatives, between right and left, between liberals and conservatives. It was an up-down election. It was an election of revolt. It was a populist earthquake in 2016 in both parties. In both parties, people in the middle and the bottom were saying, hey, up there, Wall Street, corner office in the CEO in the corporation, you've forgotten us. Bring us back. So Trump's credibility with those people was extremely strong because he was articulating, the same way Bernie Sanders was, articulating their pain. And if the Democratic Party doesn't get that message and doesn't get back together, then Trump and the conservative populism is going to work.
What do these words mean nowadays? Middle class, conservative, liberal. They've all changed their meanings. They all mean different things to different people. What I think of is now used as the middle class, those hard-working yeoman people I talked about. In my day, they were the working class. They worked in factories. They were called the working class. Now they're called the middle class, although they are the same people, and they're much worse off than they have been in a very long time. And there's no immediate prospect that they're going to be better off unless you succeed, people like you succeed, and we get some reasonable balance between wealth and labor, which is out of kilter. What do these words mean? What is a conservative today? A conservative was a person, in my book, who wanted to conserve things. These are exploiters. They're not conservatives in those terms who push conservatism. The middle class was the working class. Now it's called the middle class, which in a way makes life more difficult for it, I think, by the changed name. The aspirations are up and the ability to meet those aspirations is down. And liberals have been sort of given a bad name, so now they're calling themselves back to an old word, a word that was current in the time of Teddy Roosevelt, progressive. We've messed the debate with changing the meaning of the words, haven't we?
Yeah, we have, but we've also assumed that it's politics that's got to fix it all. The problems really start in the private sector. And I think the context, understand, first of all, I'm a journalist. It's not my job to fix the economy. I'm trying to report on what I see going on, okay? But what I see going on is a contrast between a Costco and a Walmart. Now, Walmart is the biggest single hirer of American workers in America. And it likes to have temporary workers. It likes to have workers who come in and go out, high turnover, low benefits, low wages. It's not a very stable workforce. And if you look at Costco, it's another big box retailer in the same business. And Jim Sinegal and the people who've been running Costco for a long time, they pay their people better. They give them better benefits. The health benefits they give them not only benefit the employees, but they mean that those people, when they have major health problems, they're not dumped on the public health system. They're not dumped on Medicaid, and they're not dumped on emergency rooms in hospitals. So you have two different kinds of capitalism going on here today. And Walmart has become the flavor of the decade. It's the one that's being copied by everybody else. But the one that's actually strengthening the American middle class, and those workers are all middle class workers at both Costco and Walmart. By the way, I mean, the retail employment has gone up enormously. Employment in the health industry has gone up enormously. Employment in all kinds of insurance and banking. So those are all middle class. We tend to associate middle class with factory jobs, with making cars, with assembly lines, maybe making aircraft and that kind of stuff, or working on an oil rig in Texas or Oklahoma. That's certainly middle class. But the great bulk of the middle class today is working either in retail, in the hospitality industry, in hotels and resorts and restaurants. Those people need to be better taken care of. They're being terribly lowly paid. I mean, the minimum wage today is so low. The federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour that 28 states have on their own gone and raised the minimum wage higher in their state. California and New York, others, they're moving towards a $15 minimum wage. Seattle as a city has got a $15 minimum wage on an escalated basis. What's going on is people out in the country are starting to take care of the problems you and I are talking about that are being ignored in Washington. Washington is not fixing these problems. It's happening out in the states.
When we began our conversation, you mentioned the states were taking charge of some of these problems. How far can the states go? A lot of these are huge societal issues.
Yeah.
Can the states fix them? And if one state makes itself too attractive a place to live and work, doesn't that beggar its neighbors?
Well, there's a limit to what the states can do. But California now with 30 million people, it's about the 10th largest economy in the world. You know, I mean, and it's more than 10% of the American economy. So that's a huge place. But you're absolutely right. There's a limit to what states can do. And if you have states having different tax systems and different minimum wage systems, then they start competing with each other, and there's a beggar thy neighbor problem. So fixing some of these things in a federal way is necessary. But look at our history, Llewellyn. If you go back to the progressive era at the beginning of the 19th century, giving the right to vote to women, direct election of senators, trust busting by Teddy Roosevelt, the income tax amendment, those things all bubbled up from below. Beginning of the 20th century. I misspoke, thank you. Beginning of the 20th century, but all those things bubbled up from below. Wisconsin, Minnesota, some other states, California, other states, they were experimenting with these things before they became federal law.
There is something else happening, and this program has looked at it several times, and that is the gig economy. Everybody is a temporary worker. Right. Employers, as you mentioned, like it because they don't have to get into health care. They don't have to fire. They just don't have to call you up to come in. You just drift away. The gig economy is going to be a big factor. We see it with Uber drivers or Lyft with the rival firm, etc. How do we deal with that? How do we ensure that people doing gig work get a decent pay for their gig?
Well, in other countries, in Europe, for example, in the Netherlands and other places, they have some laws that say part-time workers are entitled to partial benefits. In other words, a partial retirement benefit, partial health benefit, some kind of connection between the employer and the employee. You know, the power situation in America today, you described earlier, unions have been weakened. If you look at the lobbyists that have taken over Washington, if you look at Washington today, there are 12,000 corporate lobbyists. There are 400 for organized labor. 12,000 to 400. Guess who has the influence, you know, on the legislation? If you look at soft money going into political campaigns, business interests outspend labor interests 60 to 1. Not 1 to 1, not 2 to 1, not 3 to 1, 60 to 1. Is there any wonder that Washington is tilted heavily in favor of corporate interests? That's something we have to be awakened to. So the political reforms that are going on in the states for public funding of campaigns, for fixing gerrymander reform, for exposing dark money, all those are efforts to try to bring this political system that we have, broken as it is, to the public.
Hedrick Smith, that concludes our broadcast. We're so glad you're here. We're so glad that you're in journalism. We're very glad that you're in public life. This program can be seen around the country and can be heard on SiriusXM Radio. And you can go to our website, which is whchronicle.com, where you can read some of my columns, or you can read them on Inside Sources, the syndicate, which distributes my work. Until next week, thank you for coming along. Cheers.